why is it not true of other immigrants? Why were
Yeah.
the Jews so upwardly mobile? The answer is actually extremely heartbreaking. Other immigrant communities continued to supply that first generation that would work in the sweatshops. The Jewish community very much misunderstands ourselves in America. A lot of Jews feel like they are an immigrant community. They feel that they are an oppressed minority. We're neither of those things.
All right, everybody, it's Michael Shermer. It's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show. This one is a very important and slightly dark topic. I'm going to introduce our guest by reminding you all of what happened after October 7th, 2023, the day after Hamas killed 1,200 Israelis. The Democratic Socialists of America held a protest. Oh, yeah, I bet they were protesting the killers. No, in solidarity with the Palestinian people in their right to resist 75 years of occupation and apartheid. 34 Harvard student organizations signed a joint statement excusing the murder and kidnapping of women and children. Quote, "The apartheid regime is the only one to blame," the statement read. "The coming days will require a firm stand against colonial retaliation," wrote Yale law professor Zarina Grewal on X after the attack. "Prayers for the Palestinians. Israel is a murderous, genocidal settler state, and Palestinians have every right to resist through armed struggle and solidarity." Excuse me. Leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, BLM, wrote that it stands in solidarity with our Palestinian family and called on people to understand the resistance in Palestine as an attempt to tear down the gates of the world's largest open-air prison. The Chicago BLM chapter posted a graphic stating, "I stand with Palestine," excuse me, along with the silhouette of a paraglider, referring to Hamas terrorists who had paraglided into a music festival and killed 260 young people. Okay, there's been a lot that's happened even since then. To help us make sense of all this is Batya Ungar-Sargon, who you know, returning champion on the show here, and a regular columnist for the Free Press and host of Batya on NewsNation, where she's a weekend anchor. An Orthodox Jew who describes herself as MAGA left, whatever that is, we'll find out in a minute. She earned her PhD in English from the University of California, Berkeley, and lives in Brooklyn, New York. She's the author of Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy, and Second Class: How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women. And the new book is The Jews and the Left, from which I got this little introductory remarks. This book is chock full of comments like that are just hard to believe. Batya, nice to see you. Thanks for helping us make sense of this craziness.
Thank you so much for having me. What a pleasure to be back on the show.
Well, so give us your own journey. You're Jewish, and you have a background in this. Your, I guess, grandparents came here through Ellis Island and the whole thing.
So my grandparents came. They must have come through Ellis Island. It's funny. It's not part of our family story. I'm a third generation, in one case, fourth generation American. And so to us, especially as a religious family, that's very unusual. Most people's families came after the war in the community that I live in. A lot of Russians came even, 30 years ago. So I always had this feeling that, we were real Americans and that our story was really deeply intertwined with the story of America. My grandfather was an Orthodox rabbi who grew up in Brownsville, New York, and he was very, very religious, ultra-Orthodox, and he always said to us, America is a wonderful country for the Jews. And so this was like part of the lifeblood of my family growing up, despite being, we were very, very religious, but also very, very American.
Wow. Yeah. Well, and that's how it was for, a century until something happened. But let's start with a couple of definitions here. So, yeah, we know what the Jews are. What's the left? Here's the title, The Left. I mean,
you
something
say
has happened.
We know what the Jews are. Not everybody knows that.
Okay.
Tucker Carlson's out here saying we need to be taking DNA tests.
That's true. Yeah, even that, you're right, because some people think it's a different race or you're different skin color. You're not white, or you are white, or you're ultra white, or
right, right.
Yeah, that is crazy.
It's crazy, yeah, because of course Jews, we see ourselves as both an ethnicity and a religion. And we've been hated for both of those pieces, like the ancient anti-Semitism, the Middle Ages anti-Semitism was, well, you're the wrong religion. And then it became, well, you're the wrong ethnicity, you're the wrong race. And even today, you see both of those things sort of percolating in the spaces where people don't like Jews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I was researching the Holocaust deniers, there was this whole theme, that ancient theme of, the Jews killed our Lord. It's like, right. Jesus was Jewish, right? There were no Christians. And the other thing that's bothered me is like the whole thing is, like predestined. He had to die for our sins, and you will have everlasting life if you accept him as your savior because he was crucified and resurrected. The whole thing had to happen according to this cosmic plan. So shouldn't you be thanking the Jews, or really the Romans, for executing your Lord? I mean, really, it's just astonishing.
It is. I do have to say, just because we're talking about Christians, American Christians uniquely organized their religion in a very different way than Christians historically did. And this is a big part of the first chapter of the book. Jews arrived here in 1655. The Jewish community very much misunderstands ourselves in America. A lot of Jews feel like they are an immigrant community. They feel that they are an oppressed minority. We're neither of those things. We were founding partners in the creation of this great nation. And that is singularly because American Christians decided to organize their religion around the idea that Jews are partners and worthy of protection and precious and a blessing to wherever they decide to live. This was a huge part of early American culture and utterly unique to American Christians, originally American Protestants, and then later after Vatican II, American Catholics as well. And this is just a story that is never told. It is never told. It's not told by Jews. And I don't know that Christians are even aware of how unique their philo-Semitism is, but it is. And it is a story that I am trying to tell with this book as well.
Yeah, you do. There was a lot I learned that surprised me. I mean, my own knowledge just picks up in the civil rights movement, and I was astonished when I was researching this, how many Jews were involved in helping black people. It's like, wow, okay, and then women, and so on. But to my surprise, George Washington's praise for Jews and the Jewish founding fathers. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's really incredible. The first Jews who came here in 1654, they were escaping persecution in Brazil. Brazil had been under Dutch rule, and the Dutch had been pretty tolerant of Jews. But of course, there was a Spanish Inquisition on. And when Spain retook Brazil, they gave the Jews 3 months to get out. So 15 ships left carrying all of the Jews of Recife. 14 of them went straight back to Amsterdam. One of them got lost on the way and ended up here in New Amsterdam. And initially, there was anti-Semitic persecution from Peter Stuyvesant, who was the Dutch head of the colony. And as soon as the Jews arrived, he wrote to, the Dutch East India Company and said, we need to get rid of them. Like, these people suck. And they wrote back to him and in no uncertain terms urged him to recall that, the majority of the shareholders of the East India Company were Jews and that he should stop risking their investments. And basically what happened was he kept trying to undermine the Jews. So, for example, there was a skirmish. And so all of the residents of the colony, all of the men, had to serve guard on the watchtower. And Peter Stuyvesant said, but not the Jews, because nobody would want to serve with them. They will pay a levy instead. They will pay a fine to, compensate for the fact that they are not serving in guard duty. And Asser Levy, who was one of these first Jews to arrive here, he simply said, no, I will not pay the fine. I will serve guard duty like everybody else. And Stuyvesant again wrote to the people of the Dutch East India Company, and again they wrote back to him and said, let the man serve guard duty. And so he was allowed to serve guard duty. And of course, the first thing he did after serving guard duty was insist on the citizens' rights, the burger rights that came along with serving guard duty. And again, went back and forth between Stuyvesant and the company. And they said, of course, he's serving guard duty, give the Jews burger rights. And so they were immediately considered full citizens at the time, whatever that meant. And it was funny because this guy, Asser Levy, he was a very litigious person. He sued a lot of people in the colony, including Peter Stuyvesant, including a lot of the people who were in charge. And one of the people writing this story in the historical records, he writes, a litigant is not generally a popular character, but Asser Levy was one of the most beloved citizens. He was given a lot of rights. For example, when the court would want to put somebody's, when there was like a conflict over a certain amount of money, and so they had to set it aside while the court trial went on, they would give the money to him because he was considered to be such an upstanding citizen. He was beloved. And what's so funny is you see this again and again and again throughout the early history of the United States. The stereotypes of Jews that made them loathed in the old country, like that they were good with money, that they would lend money, that they were litigious, made them utterly beloved here on United States soil because that they were seen as teaching Americans how to stand up for themselves, teaching them how to be successful. Like they would frequently be, you would read in letters and you would have the founding fathers writing like, my God, these people, they make 2 pennies out of one. Get us more of them, So it's just amazing. It's like the soil itself just utterly refused Jew hatred from day one. An utterly unique phenomenon in the history of humanity. And Jews, as soon as they got here, they knew this. They knew that they were home.
Amazing. That's such a great story. Yeah, I mean, that older stereotype of Jews being smart with money and all that stuff, they were excluded from most of the professions, so they ended up going into banking and money and so on. And then after that, they go, well, you see, the Jews, they're only going to be good with money. They don't do these other professions. That's because you excluded them. It's crazy. All right, talk about a little bit about the Civil War. There was a lot there I didn't know about and after.
Yeah, Jews fought on both sides of the Civil War, and it's really moving. You can read letters that they would write home to their families about what it was like when Jewish soldiers fighting in the Union would encounter Jews in the Confederacy. There was one guy, he was a general, and he liked to sort of shock them by like speaking to them in Hebrew when he would encounter Jews in the South. You would have literal family members fighting on opposite sides of the Civil War, which of course, again, reflects just how deeply embedded in the American story Jews were. And then, of course, there was Judah P. Benjamin, who was considered to be the brains of the Confederacy, a very high-ranking Jewish person. He was very proud of his Jewish heritage. He would get into squabbles with people and force them to back down and, never hid it and was very proudly Jewish and proudly a member of the Confederacy. And you just see this again and again. The first instance of DEI in American history was Abraham Lincoln wrote a letter to one of the top generals, and he said, we have not yet appointed a Hebrew. Let's make the next promotion be of a Jewish person. It's just amazing when you go back. There was one anti-Semitic edict from the Union when Grant decided that a bunch of Jews had been speculating in cotton, which was hilarious because his father was actually in charge of the actual business that he was. So they evicted the Jews from a certain area in Appalachia, and immediately the Jews got on their horses, traveled to the White House, got a meeting immediately with Abraham Lincoln, who was horrified by it and immediately reversed it. And this is the treatment that Jews considered to be completely normal and de rigueur. They never saw themselves as an oppressed minority until much, much later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very different than in Europe, which you point out, which is so good. All right, let's go into the 20th century and the triangle waist shirt fire. Here, I love this image in the book of what these things actually look like. I had no idea how popular these things are. Okay, so these are waist shirt, I guess dresses or whatever they are that were super popular in the 1910s, right around the turn of the century. So talk a little bit about that and then what happened.
So everybody knows the picture of the Gibson girl, right? She was the comic that accompanied a lot of the journalism at the time. And the comic who wrote it, Dana Gibson, who drew her, he claimed that there was this new woman emerging who was very empowered, but she was also very sexy. And she was very... She was a bit of a man-eater. She had a big pompadour. She had much stronger bone structure than the depictions of women in the magazines and newspapers from the Victorian era. So it was really the birth of this new American woman. And she was always wearing a shirtwaist. And a shirtwaist was... it had puffed sleeves. It was sort of big around the bust and cinched at the waist, but then really emphasizing the curves and like the presence of this new American woman. And he claimed that there was a face as well that really went with it that you could see on the streets of all of the major cities. So every girl wanted a shirtwaist. There was just an explosion of shirtwaists. And if you couldn't afford to buy one ready-made, they would sell the patterns in the newspapers, and you could buy the pattern and print it up and make your own. But basically the ready-made clothing industry was exploding at the turn of the century. You had just millions and millions and millions of dollars being made. And what you needed was, tens of thousands of workers to sit there sewing things. And this explosion of demand for ready-made clothing was also an explosion of demand for labor, for cheap labor, which was supplied by about 2 million Jewish emigres from Russia, from the Pale of Settlement. They were fleeing horrific pogroms and May laws and just vile, violent anti-Semitism. One of the photos that didn't make it into the final book was of 6 children, little children, utterly bandaged up because their neighbors had just beaten the shit out of them. I mean, you cannot even imagine, we cannot even imagine it. So basically they came here, they were destitute, they had to work, there was no welfare at the time, although there was a lot of Jewish welfare. You had Hayes and so forth. Hayes now has a really bad name, but at the time it made sure that the American taxpayer did not have to feed these people because rich Jews would feed them. And they worked in sweatshops. So basically a person would take their little apartment and they would turn it, at night they would sleep there, and during the day they'd pull out the sewing machines and people would sit there and work for, 10, 12, 16 hours a day sewing and being utterly, utterly exploited, often by other Jews because they were working for Jews. So it was a very intra-Jewish dynamic that we saw there. One of the biggest factories was called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. It was on the Lower East Side. And it had been cited many times for terrible working conditions. And one day somebody took a puff of a cigarette at 4 p.m. and flicked it, and it caught fire. And the whole building went up in smoke, 3 stories. The hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of women, mostly Jewish teenagers, girls between the ages of 13 and 18, got trapped inside and burned alive. And when they managed to open some of the windows, they just started jumping out the windows because it was better to die from jumping from the 10th story than to burn up. It's horrific what happened. It set off such a chain reaction because one of the people who was standing outside the building watching these teenage girls jump to their deaths was Frances Perkins. And she would go on to be FDR's labor secretary. And she would write the New Deal. And she later in the 60s, looking back, said the New Deal was born from the corpses of those girls who we let down. Basically, Jews started the labor movement at the time. They started massive strikes, and the strikes started to work. What's really funny, though, is as embodied by Frances Perkins, Jews created the socialist movement in America at the time and then killed it because they were very upwardly mobile. So they would be working class for 5 years, 8 years, but the Jewish proletariat had no sticking power. By 10 years, they had amassed enough money to open their own sweatshop or to open their own factory or to own the means of production. So they had both an instinctive desire to help labor, to improve the working conditions so they weren't so violent and vile as they were in the case of Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, but also they had a real respect for entrepreneurialism, for capitalism, for capital. And so basically that is what they saw in FDR. They saw this combination both of a respect for capitalism, but also a respect for labor. And so Jews really birthed this very uniquely American version of a labor movement that is very different to what you would see in Europe, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I first heard about the Triangle Waist Shirt fire from Stephen Jay Gould. He wrote an essay about this. And in general, he used to talk about it was a 3-generation progress. So the first immigrant Jews work in these kind of shops, and then so that their kids could then be the owners of the shops, so that their kids could then be the professors and the scientists and the lawyers and so on. He was the third generation, right? So he gets to be a Harvard professor. And I thought that's an interesting model. And I always wonder, is that true for other immigrants as well? Anyway, but let me just read this. Yeah.
That's a very interesting question. So why is it not true of other immigrants? Why were the Jews so upwardly mobile? The answer is actually extremely heartbreaking. Other immigrant communities continued to supply that first generation that would work in the sweatshops. The Jews, after 1933, they could no longer, that supply was cut off, and by 1945 it was dead. So the supply of the low-wage labor was murdered by Hitler. And so you only had the upper trajectory and no longer that supply from the bottom that you have in the Italian community or the Irish community or, from other places in the world where you have that sort of steady supply of the bottom rung.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So do you think that, let's just talk generally about charity, private charity versus government, welfare and wealth transfer, which we kind of take for granted now, because you mentioned the Jews taking care of each other. Well, most groups do this, right? The Mormons take care of each other in Utah and so on. It's very commonly known. Why don't other groups do this? And do you think, this is kind of a conservative liberal argument, if the state comes in and says, we're going to take care of these people, you don't have to do it, then maybe you don't have to give at the church or the synagogue because you already gave through your taxes?
I think it's a very interesting argument. I mean, even today, you look at communities like the ultra-Orthodox community, where some people are on welfare. They have 10 children, and even if you have a good job and you're making $200,000 a year, you need food stamps if you have 10 kids, right? But those societies are themselves extremely, within the society, very socialist. So you have some people at the top who make a lot of money, and then there's just like a torrent of charity coming down for everything from clothing for children to used cars to assistance paying for housing. A place like Lakewood, for example, there's just enormous transfers of wealth privately, motivated by the fact that the Bible says you have to give 10% of your income, whatever it is, So if you're a billionaire and you own a bunch of property, that is a lot of money that you have to give in charity. So I do think that there is very much a culture in the religious community. And then the secular community, the Jewish community, is just unbelievably successful due to a bunch of historical reasons, some of which we discuss, some of which we can discuss. So I think that that's probably explains a lot of it.
Yeah. I was wondering on some of these charitable 10%, if you have to declare property sold and you paid capital gain, so that's 10% of that. I think the Mormons actually keep track of some of that stuff, right? Not just income.
I promise you the Jews do too.
That's really funny. You sold that second property of yours and you made $1 million, so you got 10% of that. Wait a minute, that wasn't my income. Yes, it is. Well, because I remember Mitt Romney on his tax declaration, he had made a lot of money, most of his money from capital gains from sales, not from income. So he paid way lower taxes than the rest of it. Anyway, I just want to read this section just to reinforce that point about about this fire. You're quoting here from an observer. I learned a new sound, a more horrible sound than description can picture. It was the thud of a speeding, living body on a stone sidewalk. Thud, dead, thud, dead, thud, dead, 62 thud deads. I call them that because the sound and the thought of death came to me each time at the same instant. There was plenty of chance to watch them as they came down. The height was 80 feet. I mean, this is just astonishing. You describe these people trying to catch them, or they have a net or a cloth, and they just break right through it because of this. And that's only 80 feet. Imagine those people on 9/11 that jumped from hundreds of feet up. Oh, just so. I mean, it's just the most horrible dilemma. Do I want to die by fire or die by jumping out? I don't know what that would even be like.
I was at a debate about this, about whether Zionism still has a place on the left. And I said something like, the real insult here is that Jews built the American left and then the left turned on them. The anti-Semites on the right love to share this clip as if I've, admitted something horrible. But of course, what it meant to be on the left for the first half of the 20th century was no thud dead, thud dead, thud dead, right? It meant, it meant a 40-hour work week and that your children weren't slaving away in sweatshops. Jews did that. It didn't mean like trans, you know what I mean? It meant it meant civil rights for blacks, like that there weren't two fountains. It didn't mean DEI. Like, if you wanted to go back and you wanted to see what the 20th century looked like without Jews, you would have children working in sweatshops, civil rights movement, 70% of the lawyers working on cases in the civil rights movement, which, by the way, the law is where the actual change happened, were Jews, So to me, it's like, yeah, all of this stuff that both sides today acknowledge, that is what we want for our nation and our neighbors. A lot of the idea of the 40-hour work week, the idea that you should have, it wasn't 40 hours at first, it was 50 hours, it was 60 hours, which already was a huge break. A lot of this had to do with the fact that the Jews, some of them who came here, stayed religious and they wanted to not work on Shabbos, right? Like, this is just an amazing gift that the Jewish community gave. But then again, like I said, like, it didn't turn into communism. It didn't turn into socialism. It left that. It morphed out of that because of this healthy respect for capital that was also within this like highly upwardly mobile community.
Yeah, I think people today have no idea how bad working conditions were, like in the 19th century.
Yeah.
You look at the percentages of people that died, in labor, building the railroads or working in any of these factories. I mean, it's just astonishing. And that the owners just kind of took it for granted. Well, it's the cost of doing business. We're going to have a bunch of people die and they're going to get injured. We ship them off. We don't have to pay anything. It was the Jews that said, we got to do something about this. And that's what you're documenting here. All right, so you take us into the civil rights movement and the percentage of lawyers and so on behind that. What about the women's rights movements and LGB and all that stuff that happened in the 70s and 80s?
It did, yeah. At some point, and I talk about this, the left shifted from wanting equal rights for everybody to what we have today, which is really a kind of a worship of abjection, an elevation of weakness as itself virtuous, and a hatred of power and strength. And that started in the 60s. After Dr. King was killed, you had the Black Power movement, which started to sort of reject what they saw as, cringy, conciliatory nature of Dr. King's vision that we're all going to live together in this colorblind society, and instead advocated for the separatism. We can't make it work. Like, this is never going to work. They started to see themselves as having more in common with the decolonialist movements in the third world, to where you had a native population fighting against a white foreign oppressor, as opposed to seeing themselves as inherent in the American project. And from there, you really started to see the universities picking up this language, this, post-colonial, anti-white, anti-Semitic framework. And in 1967, when Israel won the Six-Day War, that was actually the first time America started to see it as a potential ally in a larger context. America was not super pro-Israel before that. It did not give Israel any help in 1948. That was actually the Russians through the Czechs. The Americans wanted to have this kind of neutral position between Israel and the Arabs, and it was only during the Cold War and after 1967 specifically, they started to see Israel as potentially a weapon in the fight against the Soviets, which is where the big funding for Israel started under Nixon, by the way, an unrepentant anti-Semite. So it had nothing to do with being pro-Jewish or pro-Israel. It was just about the fight against the Soviets. But that language, the Soviet language that Zionism is racism, started to percolate in the university. Again, that had very little to do with Jews and much more to do with fighting America, right? Everybody started to see Israel as this kind of proxy. The Arab states and the Russians were, of course, on the same side here. And the university started to embrace this view of strength and power as evil and weakness and abjection as virtuous. And Jews really got caught up in that, started to be portrayed as the bad guy. And this started to create a massive conflict, which was unconscious for a long time, between their identity as liberals, which for many American Jews sort of defined their Judaism, especially after the Civil Rights Movement. They saw their involvement in the Civil Rights Movement through a religious lens. So there was this conflict now brewing between their identity as Jews and their identity as liberals. And that would really come to define the following decades and really explode in October 7th, where for most Jews, that was just like a cosmic glitch in the matrix. They were certain that their leftist allies would understand that they were the oppressed in this situation and were utterly horrified to be put on the side of the oppressors. Mm-hmm. And this is the thing I most want Jews to take away from this is we were never the oppressed. We were never the oppressed here. We're not the oppressed in Israel. Like, that's the wrong framework. Mm-hmm. We were always the Americans. And it's a tragedy to me that so many American Jews don't understand this because they are so attached and committed to the left.
It's an interesting conflict. Yeah, I mean, I get the never again theme there, given what's happened for 4,000 years and given what happened in Nazi Germany. I totally get this. But I like how you kind of delve into the deeper ideological shift that happened in the postmodern movement with Derrida and Foucault and Gremsky and so forth, that there was a shift from the search for truth about the way things actually are to there is no absolute truth. It's whoever's in power. You know, and that kind of happened in the 60s and 70s. I remember reading Foucault in grad school where, there's no such thing as mental illness. It's, it began on this date in 1700, whatever, of whoever was deciding what was the right thing and the most powerful thing. Like, what? But there are schizophrenics, there are people that, anyway. So then because Jews are successful and they're doctors and lawyers and so forth, then they get portrayed as not rising, pulling themselves by their bootstraps out of, the lower classes, but as oppressors against who? Well, if you have an oppressor, there has to be an oppressed. So who would that be? I guess the Palestinians and the Arabs and so forth in that area.
Yeah, and blacks here. There was a lot of language about that.
Yes.
Because, the in that transition from Dr. King's movement to the Black Power movement, one of the ways that you showed that you were sort of chic and cool and avant-garde, and with like the new version of it, the cool young version of it, was to be against whites, which because the whites they knew who were in the movement were Jews, frequently resulted in just explicit anti-Semitism.
Yeah, remember Louis Farrakhan? People forget him. Very anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
And a leader of a large black following, at least with the Nation of Islam. But yeah. So how do you respond to people who say, but Israel, therefore the Jews, they are colonizers. Look what they did. They took the land from the Palestinians and so forth. How do you respond to those kind of criticisms?
I wouldn't say they're colonizers. I mean, Jews have a historic connection to the land of Israel. They won it in a fight in which they were sort of outmatched and expected to lose. There was a war. People win wars and lose wars, especially people who have this ancient connection to the land that I think very few people really contest. Certainly Muslims I don't think contest that. This is not to say that Israel is beyond reproach. There's a lot of stuff that happens, especially in the West Bank, that I am completely opposed to. But the framework in which, Israel has no right to exist as a Jewish state, this to me stems from woke thinking in which strength and power are inherently evil. No one is allowed to win a war except the oppressed, and the oppressed are allowed to use rape and torture and murder of babies and elderly in order to do so, and we're not allowed to call them out. This is the framework that results in the left, as you originally read, siding with Hamas. Basically, there's nothing in their framework to prevent that. Like, there's nothing in the way they see the world to help them but sympathize with Hamas, because Hamas has less power than Israel. Ergo, it is the virtuous in this context. That is how they see everything.
Yeah, it was like the gays for Palestine.
Right.
They'd throw you off the roof if you went there, right? Yeah. So what is that? Okay. Is it anti-Semitism? Is it, well, Gad Saad calls this suicidal empathy? Is it this kind of postmodern oppressor oppressed? How do you explain this new form of well, I think it's anti-Semitism.
I think it's all of the above.
Okay.
There are anti-Zionists who are not anti-Semites. I know some.
Okay.
I know some Palestinians I'm very close with who wish Israel didn't exist because it came at their expense. And they love Jews, like they don't hate Jews. And to say that they are, by definition, must be anti-Semites because they wish Israel didn't exist, like they just want the land of their ancestors back. Trust me, like I relate to that, like that's a human impulse. But the majority of people who wish Israel didn't exist have no connection to the land. They have no connection to the Middle East. They don't know any Palestinians. They got caught up in a movement. It is the latest virtue signal on the left to avoid taking responsibility for all of its other failures, most notably on the labor front, where the left has totally abandoned labor, which now votes for Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how much of this is what Rob Henderson calls luxury beliefs? These are American intellectuals who have no connection to Israel, as you said, and they just go out there to march and protest because, well, that's the thing to do this day or whatever. And they're not, in other words, they're not deeply anti-Semitic. They don't even know what they're talking about. What's the river, river to the sea? What's the river? I don't know.
Yeah. I think a lot of it. I call it vanity morals,
Vanity morals. That's nice. Yeah, I like that.
They want to they want to portray themselves as on the side of the little guy, on the right side of history, but without actually having to make real sacrifices to acknowledge the humanity of their political opposition in America, which happens to be working class and happens to be much poorer than them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you reconstruct the congressional hearings with Elise Stefanik and the presidents of Harvard, Penn, and MIT. I mean, it was just painful to watch. I mean, the free speech people, they say, well, what Pam Gay said was technically correct. It's like, yeah, but everybody can see the hypocrisy. If he'd said, it's okay to call for the enslavement of all blacks, that would not be tolerated on campus.
Right, but I think something that was lost on a lot of people is it wasn't actually anti-Semitism. If they had been talking about white students, they would have said the exact same thing. They were giving Jews the white treatment. They were giving Jews the Republican treatment. And a lot of Jews balked at that, because of this sort of ADL line. Well, we are the oppressed. We should be treated like other minorities. No, I'm sorry, but that is the exact wrong approach. No, we should be honored to stand with white, conservative, working class Americans who get the same treatment from these elites because those are the people who have our backs as Jews. It's the binary itself that is sick. It is a sickness and a cancer in this society. And to insist that they just reclassified us, no, put us with the oppressed, give us the trans treatment where no one is allowed to say anything that we don't like. I'm utterly against that. I utterly reject that.
Nice. Speak out. Yeah. Well, you are. but why? Okay, MAGA left. Okay, we have to return to that. What is that?
I don't know. I think Trump is just like an FDR figure. Like if you look at what he stands for, he stands for labor, right? I mean, border, a tight border, mass deportations. He wants a tight labor market, which I'm sorry, for 100 years was the progressive left position. Samuel Gompers, all through Bernie Sanders in 2015, thought open borders and immigration hurt the working class. That is a leftist position, okay? So Trump is left on immigration. Tariffs, a leftist proposition. Big government, let's control trade. We don't believe in trade with foreign countries. Yeah, sure, capitalism within the limits of the United States is great. But we don't owe the Chinese Communist Party doesn't have a human right to flood our marketplace with cheap goods so that Americans can't afford to buy things made by other Americans. No, screw that. That's a leftist position, right? This big government. He doesn't believe in free trade. So that I see him as an FDR. He's not a conservative. He's a moderate. He made it very clear during the campaign he supports abortion rights for 6 to 12 weeks, and he would veto a national abortion ban. And then on war, he believes only in using the military in the defense of the United States to put Americans first. This is sort of, people are giving me a hard time about this now. They're like, we're at war with Iran. It's a little bit, but you know what? We're not doing a regime change. We're not putting boots on the ground. This isn't like the Bush era, military intervention. These are very limited operations to defend our children and grandchildren.
Hopefully. As they say, it's easy to start a war. It's much harder to end it and get out. Yeah.
True.
Well, yeah, I know. I've been saying that since the first administration. He's not a conservative. I mean, I was at a conference where there was, a bunch of libertarians, and it's like Trump is not a libertarian. I mean, he's not a free trade, pro-capitalist guy. That's not what you voted for. So I don't know. But
this is the gayest administration in American history.
Really?
And, yeah. First of all, Scott Bessent is the highest-ranking out gay man in American history.
Okay.
Right. The staffs are just lousy with. And I say this like in a positive way, and I think Trump is very proud of it.
Yeah. All right. So now there's a split over Iran. Since you brought that up, the Megyn Kellys of the world are saying, I love Trump, I voted for Trump, but now I'm not vibing this war thing. And then now she's joined with Tucker and other classic conservatives against the neocons that are pushing for war, Lindsey Graham and Mark Levin. All right. So what do you make of that whole division?
I don't see that as a divide on the right. About 85% to 90% of Republican voters back Trump in Iran. So that's not a split. I mean, 10% versus 90% is not a split. The influencers, the podcasters, I call them the podcastariat, they have split from the president and are kind of moving to the left now, which is really funny. So you see Marjorie Taylor Greene every day on CNN. CNN has strange new respect for her.
I know.
You see like Anna Kasparian praising Candace Owens. You see Tucker Carlson very anxious to meet with Graham Plattner, the Senate candidate for the Democrats in Maine, who has a Nazi tattoo, right? So you really are seeing this kind of horseshoe moment but these people have left the right. The right itself has kicked them out. So on my show in NewsNation, I've had senators, congressmen, members of the president's cabinet, all Republicans saying we're done with these people because they're obsessed with Israel and they're obsessed with blaming Jews for every problem in America and everything they don't like about Trump. Trump himself kicked Tucker Carlson out of the party. So I just think the right is being, very, very circumspect about this, having really important conversations about where free speech ends and anti-Semitism begins, and has basically said, look, this is, and they are where the voters are. They are where 85-90% of voters are. So it's a very different scene on the right and on the left. Basically, in America, when you reach a certain level of tolerance for blaming Jews for all of your problems, you end up on the left. That's kind of what it seems like to me right now.
What about the claim that Netanyahu visited the White House 7 times and he must have been pulling the strings and controlling Trump and so on? I saw a good debate. Coleman Hughes and Glenn Greenwald debated this. And, I think my take in it is, it's business as usual. Everybody's trying to get the ear of the president. Everybody wants to influence the president, right? That's normal. Does he, in fact, actually allow himself to be controlled that way? Your thoughts?
I just don't think you can look at Trump and see a person who lets anybody control him. Like, it's just ridiculous. Like, Israel's a client state of the United States. What did Bibi use to force Trump to do something Trump didn't want to do in this scenario? What leverage does Bibi have over Trump? Nothing. Like, Trump will already go down in history as the most pro-Israel, pro-Jewish American president. Like, he's got that sewn up. If he hadn't gone to war in Iran, he would have had that sewn up. If Bibi tomorrow tweeted, Trump has betrayed Israel and America, nobody would care. Like, he has no leverage on Trump. Like, Trump is, give me another scenario where Trump has allowed himself to be led to do something he didn't want to do. He's been promising to do this for 40 years. It's like utterly ridiculous. And everybody admits this had to be done. There is not a single person apart from Tucker Carlson and some other far left people who think it would be okay for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Everyone says someone had to do this. So, like, the
Yeah.
idea that this was like some alien foreign thing, like, oh, who saw this coming? He's only been promising to do it for 40 years. I just feel like I don't understand how people really believe that unless their brains have been torqued by, the ancient hatred.
Well, there's some of that. We'll return to that in just a moment. But were they, in fact, going to get a nuclear weapon? Okay, this story goes back to Obama and Bush and so on. Everybody's been worried about this. Why didn't they do something? Why did Trump do it? Why didn't Obama do something or whatever? He negotiated a deal and had treaties and contracts and all that stuff. I don't know what happened.
I think Obama was very much in this, not just in Iran, in the entire Middle East, in this like appeasement moment. He was under the misimpression that, these very extremist Muslims were like secret liberals, like, yearning to be free. That's just not the case. So he had this very liberal view of the world that I think was very wrong. I think other presidents were not willing to risk the political capital to do this. They kicked the can down the road. And it is very much to Trump's credit that he possibly will lose the midterms over this. He was so convinced that he was the only one who would protect our children and grandchildren from having to face off against a nuclear-armed terror state that he was willing to risk the political capital. And, that's a very hard thing to do. I think probably his narcissism helped. Like, he probably thinks he's still going to win and he's going to, it'll be fine. And so he's buoyed by his healthy sense of self-regard, which I think is a good thing in a leader, because he doesn't really care what anybody thinks about him or what anybody says about him. But a lot of other people care a lot, especially about what the media says about them. And I think that probably kept them from acting.
But why Iran? North Korea was threatening this back in the 90s. Clinton was saying, we got to do something about this. And they just went ahead and made their bombs anyway.
Right.
Why didn't he do something to stop it? Why not bomb North Korea before they could build it? I don't know.
The problem with North Korea was that it's always been extremely close to South Korea. And so the ballistic threat that Iran, by the way, this was what Iran's model was. They wanted enough ballistics and enough ballistic capability that nobody could stop their nuclear program, because then they could just destroy the entire Middle East. North Korea had that advantage built in already just by being so close to South Korea. Every one of its missiles was already enough of a threat, I think, to prevent a more robust, muscular opposition to its nuclear program. But I was not alive then, so I don't really, or I certainly wasn't conscious. When was this? Was it the 80s or the 70s?
Yeah. Well, the Kim regime has been going since the 50s, but yeah, they started making nuclear rattles in the 80s, under Reagan. Yeah, so, okay, right. Well, that's always a problem. Which targets do you pick around the world? We can't help everybody. This is always one of these, foreign policy issues. Everybody, lots of countries need help. We want to help as many as we can, but we can't do everything.
Well,
right? So,
honestly, I don't want to help anybody. I wouldn't have wanted Trump to do this for the Iranian people. I wish them well. I want them to win. But I don't want to spend any money on that or any soldiers. I don't want a single soldier to die for somebody else's freedom. You cannot give people freedom. Like, the sad thing is, their men have to be willing to die for it. That is the only way that you can become free. And I don't think Trump is doing it for them, and I wouldn't support him doing it for them. I know that sounds harsh, but
that's kind of what. But Marjorie Taylor Greene's been saying that, right? And now she's called a traitor by Trump for saying this.
But she's wrong, because he's not doing it for them. Like, he has not done a regime change. He has not put.
Well, but I know. But that first night he said, "Okay, you're now free. I have freed you, Iranian people. Go ahead and take over."
Yeah, it was inaccurate.
Yeah, and then that the son of the Shah was on 60 Minutes like the next week going, "Yeah, I'm going to go in there and we're going to make a great democracy." It's like, okay, what happened to him? Maybe you just can't do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's hard, right? We're assuming. Well, this was like back in W's day, where he was talking about Iraq, and he said he had read Sharansky's book, The Case for Democracy. So I read that book. I thought, yeah, that's a good argument. We should help people become democracies. This would be good, and it does sound good until the people actually don't want democracy because they're tribal or whatever.
Right. Yeah, I don't believe in that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Because of the nature of tribalism and that sort of thing.
Well, we've proven very bad at it. there's cultural, and also this view that like you cannot give people freedom. I think historically, like it just doesn't. They have to be willing to
They
fight
have to
for
take it. Yeah. Okay. All right.
it hurts me. I feel very sorry for the women in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
But
Horrible.
We cannot free them. Their men have to be willing to die for them to be free, and that's just the nature of the world. I think that's why we've been so bad at regime change historically.
Okay, I know you got to go here in a few minutes because you're on your book tour. A couple of big questions. What happened to Tucker Carlson? I don't know what's worse, that he actually believes this stuff about Hitler was the good guy and Churchill was misunderstood, and or the bad guy and Hitler was misunderstood, or all the kind of Holocaust stuff and denial. Does he believe this? Is it clickbait? Is it the attention economy? I don't know what is going on here.
I would say all of the above, probably. It's very sad to me because he was very good to me. He had me on his show on Fox News when I was a nobody. He was very kind to me. And up until the Daryl Cooper, I was still sort of trying to engage with him. And then after he had this guy on and agreed with him that Hitler was like, not the villain of World War II, I was sort of like, that was my moment where I was like, oh, wow, this person is like a completely different person now. I don't know what happened. It's funny because when Nick Fuentes went on his show, he was literally the second Holocaust denier he had on. It was kind of wild. I think he has become convinced that if you scratch beneath the surface of any problem, you'll find people of a certain ethnicity. That's what it seems to me. Like that, this is a true conviction he's arrived at. Although Megyn Kelly said the other day that he has like millions and millions and millions, tens of millions of new viewers who are Muslims. So that could also explain it. I've been saying this for a year with Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson. Their exploding support is not domestic. It's not Americans. You cannot go full anti-Semite in America and become more popular. That's my view. I write about this in the book a lot. I think this is sort of foreign, there's 2 billion Muslims really anxious for some spicy anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist content that's well produced. So I would reckon that's kind of the answer.
Okay. All right. The deeper problem, why anti-Semitism? 4,000 years. Why does it continue? Are we seeing an upsurge of this, or is it something else? Your thoughts? Why the Jews?
I know. I always feel, well, you tell me. I don't know. What is it about us that makes us so annoying? Like, why are people so obsessed with us? I don't really understand it. Like, I think I need people who are not Jewish to tell me.
Well, I do think, so I do think there's some tribalism there. There's the other, there's the isolation of Jewish people, and then they become successful anyway. Then there's the general, we need to blame somebody, like the stab in the back conspiracy theory that Hitler had in the 1920s. The reason the Germans lost World War I was because of the Jewish bankers and militarists and so on. And that's an easy target to glom onto as an excuse for why we are not successful, because of those people over there. There was Daniel Goldhagen's book, Hitler's Willing Executioners. How easy it was to get other people that were not German to join in on the the exterminationism of the Nazi program in the 40s. Right. So, I mean, not everybody. There were heroes and people that stepped up, but most didn't, or they just were bystanders and they closed their eyes and pretended not to see what was going on. I think that's, a combination of some of that tribalism and just we need somebody to blame.
I will say whatever it is like almost thoroughly absent in the United States. So it's whatever makes America unique is the thing that it's like the anti-Semitism killer. I do think it's getting better, though. People think it's getting worse. But if you look at what's happening in the Middle East, right now you have the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, and Israel all coming together into a coalition helmed by the United States to fight Iran. Like that, we're in the next stage of history already.
Nice.
Al Jazeera is now pro-Israel. Like it'll put out articles about how Israel's fighting Iran so well. So I think we're in the next stage already. No one's going to forget that Iran sent more missiles to the UAE than it did to Israel. And so to me, the demand for anti-Semitic content is going to be coming from much fewer places. And of course, when you have Saudi and Israel working together, the Palestinian issue will hopefully, God willing, be resolved as well. And I do think that a lot of that will calm down.
Okay, last two questions. Abraham Accords, you support those? You think they're going to stand?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. And then what's the future of the two-state solution? Where do you stand on that? What do you think is going to happen?
What I hope will happen is that the West Bank, the Palestinians in the West Bank will become Israeli citizens. I don't see why they shouldn't be, and I think that will solve the problem there. It seems to me like that is the solution most favored by most people at this point. The Israelis don't want to give up the land, and the Palestinians want to be citizens of a nation state. And I don't think there's enough of them to threaten the Jewish majority. So to me, that just seems like the most obvious answer. And then I think that it would be much easier to deal with the Gaza situation when it's considered a separate one. But I'm not a stakeholder. I'm an American. So,
you're an American.
Up to the Israelis.
All right, there it is. The Jews and the left. Batya Ungar-Sargon, very nice. What are you working on next? I know you're on your book tour now for this, but you're always writing something and working on some future project.
Oh boy, I just started a Substack, so I'm writing for that every
day.
Day. Yeah.
Okay, where can we find you?
BatyaUS.com, .substack.com, or Batya-US.com. So I write for that every day. I write my show every week, and then I'm doing a daily debate on YouTube for NewsNation called Prove It with Batya at 4 p.m. every day live. We do polls, and it's great. We have a good time.